Thank you everyone for being here on Friday when the conference is about to end. And I wanted to kind of open up. My background is in neuroscience, and really anxiety happens to be one of my areas that I'm fascinated by, being a person who runs a little more anxious. It's kind of my biology to like learn and understand things. And so when I came up with this talk a couple years ago, I kind of started to see, and I was actually, when I was in graduate school, I was identified as having anxiety due to getting about like 80 emails from my advisor every day. And that's kind of known as situational anxiety. Once you remove the stimuli, the anxiety kind of will fall away. And so for me, it's a really important element to destigmatize it and to recognize and help people recognize when it may be arising in themselves, arising in their classroom, and be in the air, right? I mean, I think we've been breathing the past 2.5 years of each other's, excretion of oxygen, and there's been anxiety just in the atmosphere. And so, and I think for educators, I was kind of thinking today, I was like, you know what, I really wish I made this workshop like a recharge for educators. And I'm like, maybe we could do that next year or something, because I really feel that these are tools that I'm telling you for your class, but it's also dealing with being parents, perhaps yourselves, and dealing maybe with the pressures of day in, day out that we kind of have to deal with. For anybody who came in just right now, we're going to go only for an hour. And we're going to kind of breeze through the slides. At the same time, there's a really important meditation that is a workshop-y group activity that I want you to do that I think would be awesome for you to take back to your classrooms. So today we're going to talk a bit about anxiety, and then we're going to talk about what it looks like for the anxious body and brain. So what do the symptoms look like, and what can you kind of cue up and see? We're going to talk about the asynchrony. So maybe you can have some kids that you have in your classroom who are really intellectually out there, but they can't regulate their emotions. And then we're going to talk about gifted emotions a little bit, emotional maturation, and nurturing. So what are the ways that we could kind of nurture and feed our experience and our souls? And so I do want to start out, come on in, don't worry, we're only going an hour. I want to start with like a simple breath awareness exercise for you to just kind of settle in. We're all going to settle in together. And if it's comfortable and available to you, I want to invite you to close your eyes. Now, for some people, it's not comfortable, and that's totally fine. And you could just look, about an arm length in front of you or your tip of your nose. And you could just begin to breathe in and out. And as you breathe, notice if you can follow the breath from your nostrils to the back of your throat, to your belly, or maybe on the exhale, above your lips, and just release. And if attention to your breath is overwhelming, let that go. It doesn't need to be your anchor. You could think about a neutral spot in your body, like your big toe, or maybe a fingernail, and just breathe. And exhale. And as you watch the breath, notice how they can be like waves. Some like a giant rip current, and others can be so gentle and soft on the shore. Just exhale. And collectively, we're just going to take 3 deep breaths together. And gently exhale. And as you do, begin to blink your eyes open back to the room, tap your fingers, And if you fell asleep, don't worry, your body just needs to relax, and that's okay. So yesterday, I think a few of you may have seen this, and I'm gonna actually talk about this diagram a little bit differently. That's simply when we use our breath awareness, by taking 3 deep breaths, we actually recenter our nervous system out of the sympathetic activation and bring it into parasympathetic rest. And we allow for positive neurochemicals like oxytocin and vasopressin, which are really critical for pair bonding and trust. So like one of the big things Denise Pope was talking about today was anxiety and stress, and when people don't feel safe. Just 3 deep breaths can recenter the nervous system and bring you back into a state of trust and calmness. And because some of you are taking photos of this, I'm gonna talk briefly, really quickly about these 4 elements that I've identified for the circle of awareness, where basically our thoughts, we have close to 60,000 thoughts a day. That's a lot of thoughts, right? To be able to focus our attention on. And to recognize that much of our thoughts can be automatic patterns and conditioning. So that could be yourselves, that could be children that you're dealing with, parents. And at the same time, we have these core emotions. There's 8 core emotions. Now Berkeley scientists have found 27 core emotions. And I'm kind of working on a theory about choosing emotions to bring us into love states versus fear states. So that's not ready yet. But in any event, you can basically, when we think about our emotions, the example that I always give is that basically when you can have excitement or fear, they have the exact physiological response. You have an increase in heart rate, increase in blood pressure, an increase in sweat glands, and in more rapid breathing. So when you take 3 deep breaths, you begin to recenter the nervous system. And as you do that, between the time you have a chemical release, it's about 60 seconds, 16, for you to be able to shift your awareness about the emotion. So for example, as Denise was talking about the eustress, where I could be up here and be a little bit stressed, but I'm also excited. And I could shift my consciousness and tell myself, instead of being anxious, I'm excited to see all of you and connect and talk. And so it's really the stories that we begin to tell ourselves. And then as you have kids in your classroom, you may have some kids that come across with sensory overload. How many of you ever experienced that? Sensory overload could be it could be one of those triggers or causes that can cause that basic dysregulation where you get this kind of emotional brain taking over and the higher thinking from that frontal cortex isn't online. And when that happens, a student can't learn. And so you guys not only have the problem, not the problem, but the challenge of teaching students, but at the same time, you're dealing with a student who could be stressed out and you're not even in charge of what kind of light bulbs are in the room that could be activating their nervous system. And so there's a lot that you're navigating and dealing with their nervous systems all the time. And one thing to always remember that our emotions really are meant for us to have behaviors and to take action. And so when we have that action, we want to make sure that some of our kids may come across as having kind of unconventional behaviors where they're not fitting into this sort of norm in the classroom. And so you learned a little bit about anxiety and the forms of anxiety that you can experience. But in particular, stress, as Denise was talking about, is a normal part of life. And in fact, you're going to learn that the experience of anxiety generally lasts about 24 hours and dissipates. Now, when somebody's under chronic stress, lasting longer than 6 months, it becomes into a form of anxiety disorder, where it can cause real interferences with basically every aspect of life, relationships, school, work, and basically all social interactions become altered, and a person is living off of basic chronic stress. The kind of symptoms you could see in the body for somebody, for example, is they could have exhaustion, uneasiness, that rapid heart rate. They could have headaches. So this could be your kid that's coming back from recess or in the classroom with a headache. Nausea. Nausea is a very big one, and I have a whole chapter on the gut-brain connection. We're not getting into that today, don't worry. Stomach issues, you could have issues in changing an appetite, so a loss of appetite or overeating, shakiness, and actually anxiety, we now know, changes your microbiome, so the way that bacteria helps break down food in your gut. And then in the mind, you may see a child and or, how many of you, I kind of went into this talking about kids, but how many of you experience kind of these waves of anxiety and stress throughout the day? And that's okay. You don't have to out yourself. You cannot. It's okay. And so another element is the monkey mind. So basically, it's this difficulty of concentrating, uncontrollable thoughts. You have this racing stories going on, and basically your emotions are out of control, and it really can begin to affect sleep. And this is where you could see children kind of chronically yawning in class, their attention's really falling. And then you get this sensory overload that I was talking about. So when you're stressed, you have these cortisol hormones being released, and it causes you to have this in addition to being hyper vigilant. And so you're kind of very hyper aroused and under basically scrutiny of every piece of your environment because you do not feel safe. And so this is a time that I kind of want you to pause, and all of us to pause, to recognize that when we fall into our stress response, you could fall into 4 different ways: fight, flight, freeze, and flop. Unfortunately, you can't really see freeze. It's like a little too light. But in any event, fight and flight really are your first responders. That's kind of where people go in and they kind of release that cortisol and really expend energy. The freezers and floppers really internalize things, and they will be kind of stuck in their position and they can't get inertia. And it's really important to know your default state and to be able to identify your kid's default state. So for me, for example, when I've been in the wild with sharks and bears, I run, and it's terrible. I flight, I leave everybody with me, and I'm like, I'm out of here. So just for a minute, see if you can identify with your table what pattern you tend to fall into. Flopper. So it's great you guys are all talking, and I think you got an idea of what you are. I heard some people ask, I'm not aware of what the flop is, and I kind of flopped because I didn't tell you. So freezers tend to freeze in their tracks. Floppers actually have a physiological response where they play dead. So that's like when you see a squirrel on the floor and they're like playing dead. That's kind of basically what a flopper does. And there's somebody like you actually have no motivation and inertia happening. So how many of you fell into a fighter? Like you're just like you bulldoze your way through anxiety. How many of you flight? Yeah. How many of you are a freezer and flopper? Yeah, and I mean, out of curiosity, how many of you are seeing these in your classrooms with your students? Yeah, and so it's a pretty important thing for us to be aware of. As we learn, there's an increase happening. And so the brain on anxiety really can kind of come across in a number of ways. So it's a brain fogged where, the child and or individual just is kind of out of sorts, and they can't get that frontal cortex online, and they can't get that higher order thinking going. And then there's fatigue, right? Chronic fatigue. They may go home from school right after, just flop on the couch and not be able to even get their homework done. Overwhelm is another experience. Exhaustion, physical exhaustion, like just not being able to move, physical pain. So a lot of people, for example, when I'm under stress, I get it right in my neck where I'm like, oh yeah, feels like I was just in a car accident. I don't know, But it's really important for you to recognize these signs, because that's your body telling you that you're going into distress, and you gotta kind of nurture yourself right away. You don't want it to get to physical pain. There could be embarrassment, right? You don't want to talk to people about it because you should be able to handle everything. Everybody else in your department does. And shame and guilt, you know. And so these are kind of things, and the kids could also feel defeated. This is where you get the kids that are just not doing any homework and they're zeros, and isolation. And so because we decided we're going to end a little early, I'm going to breeze through a couple of these slides. But the science is really showing that gifted individuals have these kind of higher primed brains for emotional intensities. And I don't know how familiar you are with the work of Susan Daniels, but she talks about that in her book, Living with Intensity, where she and Dabrowski kind of put together a theory on that. And so as I was inspired by that, I started researching a bunch of papers, and what I found was this one where they looked at connectivity in the brain. So they had people on the scanner, and then they wanted to look at the white matter connectivity. And what they found was a very unique it's not a network. They found a very unique pathway, and these are kind of like freeway systems in the brain, the way things communicate to each other. And what they found is that there was a greater thickness in fibers from a part of the brain for your emotional centers, your limbic system, to your frontal cortex. And at the time they were like, I don't know what this does. And scientists then further found that this anterior cingulate cortex plays a really important role in anxiety. And what I started to look into was that basically math-gifted boys began to show greater connectivity in these brain areas responsible for not only executive functioning, but also for emotional regulation. And as we kind of break it down even more, we look at this kind of circuit for anxiety, which is the anterior cingulate cortex that connects to this amygdala. So that's like the primary area of your brain where when you experience fear becomes activated. And it's so close to this part of your brain called the hippocampus, which I bet many of you as educators already know, is important for memory consolidation and long-term memory. And that's why when somebody experiences stress or trauma, that this activity coupled with the hippocampus can re-trigger the experience again and again, if you cannot turn on this part of your brain that's involved with emotional regulation. Does that all make sense? Okay, good. And then what scientists begin to even find even more is that there are neurons that are specifically activated in response to anxiety in mice when they have an anticipation of a negative experience coming about. And so that was a very interesting piece in that, because as we get to thinking about this and we think about this gifted brain, that these emotional intensities are actually hardwired. So it's really important, and many of you, I mean, being educators, you tend to be like super bright yourselves, so you end up being more, and it's weird because I'm using the word gifted, and at the same time, like we know every child has gifts, right? And a lot of my talk yesterday was about neurodiversity and like destigmatizing labels. But in reality, it's like when you go into a profession like this, you have to end up having like a high level of empathy and care and concern for the future. And as I'm talking about this, though, with this elevated intensities in this frontal cortex, that we recognize that when kids are under stress or they're experiencing these high level emotions, to let them have them. So much of the time we say, oh, you're too sensitive, get over it, it's not a big deal. And in reality, they just need to be able to allow and have the experience of them. And as I brought you back to this uncinate fasciculus that I talked to you about that had this greater connectivity between the frontal cortex and the emotional centers in the brain, they didn't know exactly what it did until this study came out, where they showed that in people who had a lesion in this area, either if they were a vet due to battle and or a stroke, that they actually lacked empathy. And their empathy really went down. And so to kind of hone in it again, that some people's brains are naturally more hardwired to have empathy. And it's just part of human variation. And this emotional development really tends to be asynchronous. You know, as we've been talking, you could have these kids who are super bright, and that same child may not be able to manage their emotions in the classroom and or with you. And really what happens as we learn is that this frontal cortex really develops all the way to our mid-30s. And actually, I'm going to tell you a little bit research later where it develops all the way throughout our life, which is kind of really good news, that we're never done. You know, so much of when I started out in graduate school, it was like, oh, the brain is fixed, you can't do this. And now it's like neuroplasticity, yay, we could change it. And you're like, educators, you're like, yeah, we knew that. We didn't need a science study to tell us. And so, you know, we were talking about anxiety and performance and tests, and this study came out where they began to look at kids who had more anxiety and perfectionism compared to their age-matched peers. And what they found that in both groups, regardless, when it was time, they performed worse and they felt more anxious. And unfortunately in this test, they showed that girls' performances declined even more when it was timed. And so this is just something for us to think about in our society. And you know, you were hearing Denise Pope talk about timed performances, and maybe a single problem may be enough to show expertise. And then how many of you, I'm just curious, love words and love to play with words and they're all right, no big deal. So this was a really interesting study that they did in adults. It was a survey study where they found that basically individuals who had a higher IQ in verbal scores showed greater rumination and worry. And I think a lot of this has to do with a couple of components. I didn't talk about it in the beginning of my talk, but it's, you know, when we think about a brain that's kind of on fire and really engaged, you have an intellectual component, right? Where the individual may know every single definition of that word, so they really want to parcelate out what it means. And then there's the other element of the why, right? And that existentialism and wanting to understand why things happen. And so it's sort of like, what did they say by, I'll take you up on that offer? And it's like, they said what they meant, but there could be that rumination that happens. And how many of you are music teachers or musicians yourself or love music? So in this study, it was really interesting. They showed that musicians tend to have more connected brains with emotional centers, and that people who tend to get chills when they hear music have an increase in dopamine, and they also have an increase in their emotional centers in their brain. And so I always kind of put this out there for kids that may be nonverbal, that communication through music may be a nice form where they can communicate about their emotions. And then I don't know how many of you are familiar with this study by Ruth Karpinski. So she was an interesting individual. She went back to college when 2 of her sons were identified as gifted, but then she also noticed that they had learning challenges. And so they had this twice exceptionality going on. And she really realized that it's not so peachy being gifted, and that her kids were actually struggling. And what she did is she took a survey where she had Mensons fill out a form. Basically, the survey looked at psychological and physiological differences that they may experience. So looking at whether or not they had allergies, all the way up to having anxiety and depression, and also other physiological things like increase in food allergies and digestive issues. And basically across the board, she found an increase by 25%. And what you're looking at here is basically the high intelligence is in, we have, yeah, okay. This is the national average is in the yellow here, this light yellow. The colors are really different on my computer, so I'm sorry. And then the high intelligence diagnosed is in this kind of darker yellow. And then you have the high intelligence combined, which is diagnosed and self-diagnosed. And she did this third category because a lot of people don't go to the doctor when they actually are dealing with mental health issues. And so this is just something to be aware of, that, you know, kids aren't going to want to talk about it. There's going to be maybe shame involved, and even adults. And so to just be aware that this is a higher rate, it's about 25% more in high performers. And the important element about this is really chronic anxiety leads to social isolation. And as people get more and more socially isolated, that could fall into a slew of other challenges where they experience depression and other forms of mental health challenges. And when we're talking about social isolation and pain in the brain, studies show that basically people who experience pain in the brain have the same activation as if you were to stub your toe. So pain is pain. And so this is just something to be aware of, to kind of give voice to when you kind of see a child isolated, going down, you know, a track by themselves, that it could be the teacher's, you know, relationship that really brings them back to the other side. And the behaviors that you can maybe see where they could get more frustrated in class, like with group projects and have a meltdown, you could see them being more moody, withdrawn. So maybe that kid that kind of had that shiny, you know, we think about what Shelley was talking about. She had this joy one year, and then it went down to this very deep darkness, and then the joy came back when that teacher and the school and the environment fit her just right. Highly distractible, where they can't kind of complete tasks, and again, that's that executive functioning that gets really altered. They seem tired. They may be underachieving in your class, so it could have been your most bright, you know, the brightest kid you had in class, and all of a sudden they're not doing their work. They may have more procrastination because they're dealing with anxiety, and they could be paralyzed and have feelings of shame. And then just that basic overwhelm, like I can't, you know, do anything. And so as I brought this to your awareness earlier, anxious thoughts really feed the anxious body and mind, and it becomes this cycle. And so the important element to kind of really break out of it is to communicate about it. And this was a study that I kind of alluded to a little bit earlier that talked about emotions. And this study was really fantastic. It was done at UC Berkeley, where they actually identified 27 core emotions. And what they had people do is they had them rate the time the emotion happened, and then the duration of the emotion, and what they did to work through the emotion. And the good news, there's good and bad news in here, that basically fear, for example, only lasts 45 minutes. So that's kind of a good news thing, that it doesn't last that long, that's something that can kind of, you know, wave in and out, and it's impermanent. That sadness lasts 120 hours. And the reason why I think sadness lasts so long is that basically you're rewriting a new story. But there was one time I read this study right before I had to give a talk, and I found somebody passed away as I was like gonna go and speak. And I realized, okay, sadness only lasts 120 hours. I could get through this. And it kind of just, that awareness shifted me to realize the impermanence of emotions. Gratitude, which we're gonna talk about, lasts 5 hours, which is really good news. And if we don't get to the slide, I wanna give you this one piece, is that every 5 hours, give yourself like a gratitude check, where you could turn on your, you know, little timer on your phone and just be like, okay, I'm grateful for I have a seat. I'm grateful for that the students are okay right now. I'm grateful that I only have an hour of work left. Whatever it is, like, you know, if you can do that, the gratitude feeds kind of a different network in the brain where you get positive reward cycles happening. Joy lasts 35 hours. And the good news is it's not just your joy, it could be joy for somebody else. So say, for example, one of your colleagues, gets, sorry, that was a little loud. One of your colleagues has some good news that they want to share with you, that joy you have for them can be a shared joy, where it can last for you as well, 35 hours. So we know noting our emotions really allows for the awareness of the experience. And as we do that, unfortunately, this is not colorful at all, but we know that, for example, if you have a feeling like anger, that there could be an underlying experience behind it where there's somebody feeling let down, humiliated. Most of the time it usually happens by an unmet expectation. So often we expect people to behave and act in a certain way, and that's why we get angry and we want them to perform. Also, happiness, you could feel more playful, kind of lighthearted, more peaceful. And so there's these underlying experiences, and then on top of that, you can have an even further feeling state. And so it's really important for us to notice that these emotions really are meant for us to take action. And it's okay for us to be aware that when everything isn't awesome, and that awareness of when it isn't awesome is actually awesome, because you let go of the attachment of what you expect the moment to be. And so we know it's really good to teach children to be emotion detectives, where they can survey and scale their environment. So I'm convinced that when we help our children find healthy ways of dealing with their feelings, ways that don't hurt them or anyone else, we're helping make our world a safer and better place. And Fred Rogers just has always known it. And then enhancing emotional intelligence really begins with that first step that we were talking about, is the self-awareness. So teaching our kids to be able to talk about our emotions and the awareness of what they're experiencing. Then the next piece that I think you struggle with, and maybe most of us do, is the self-regulation. Like, I'm having this emotion and I can have it. And it's like, yes, but at the same time, you don't want to disrupt the entire class. Empathy and compassion for what somebody is experiencing is the best way to let them know they're okay. Understanding the motivation behind, Understanding the motivation behind the emotion is really critical, and teaching them the social skills to communicate about it. And so before we go, because we are gonna end a little early, it went off early. Oh, okay. Okay, I'm okay. And so basically when we talk about anxiety, there's a wealth of evidence that shows holistic interventions that could help. Really teaching them about the physiological and emotional and sensory states where it's happening, and creating safety. The interplay of, when they have a stomach ache, to identify that it's actually anxiety and not related to a food issue. And they communicate about their anxiety and fears, and recognize that. And this is kind of a nice little setup. Identifying the cause and the trigger really allows for the healing process. So naming it, name to tame it, right? Heal to feel, and identifying the origin. So for example, you could have a kid who's dysregulated because of the lights, and if you don't identify that it's the lights, that they're having a sensory overload, then they're never gonna really be regulated. And you're not gonna be able to teach them skills to be able to work through and basically habituate and get used to it. Because we don't want it to where our kids, we have to shut the lights out all the time. We want to gradually get them to where they can navigate in the world. I mean, they can't be like, I showed up for this meeting today, but the lights are off, so all bets are off. They'd get fired, right? So we have to teach them the skill to regulate as well. And then releasing and letting go, really the non-attachment is one of the key elements. And you can use the metaphor of waves, emotions come and go, and experience are transient, and they do not last forever. And you could even do that, as an exercise. I didn't do it with you today, but sometimes I have an exercise where we could cultivate just a meditation on the word peace and recognizing where you feel peace in your body and imagining a place where you feel peaceful. And that in itself can elicit that state and evoke the child to feel. And it's not really, you know, there's a lot about being with, but there's also, you can kind of guide the mind with an intention, not force it. And I think all of you know this, but the most important element for learning and education is connection, emotional connection. And that really is grounded in safety and 3 elements: in school, in the class, at home, and basically in the community. And when a child feels safe, they can thrive. When they're in the stress response, they can't. And so I'm looking at the time here, and we're talking about neuroplasticity and the way that you can kind of rewire the mind for positive neuroplasticity. One thing I want to give you as a piece of information is we've kind of all been lied to that new habit to form is 20 days, and that's why a lot of the products people sell us don't work, because it's not true. A study came out looking at how people develop new automatic behaviors, and what they found was people self-reported, and they did basically all the way from just drinking a bottle of water at lunch every day to somebody running 15 minutes a day. What they found that actually on average it took 66 days for people to retrain their brain and new activity. Most importantly, the correlation was how difficult the task was. So if drinking a bottle of water, some of those people were able to have that automatic behavior in 20 days. People who were running 15 minutes a day, it may have taken them 3 months to make it an automatic behavior. So paying attention to how much of a target it is to change a behavior and a response, but to also give parents the ability, it takes 66 days in some cases. So, and I'm going to kind of skip through the mindfulness because I want to really do this exercise with you. And I'm going to just pull it up, where it's all about activating mirror neurons and how basically we mirror one another in our brains. That basically when we feel safety and trust, we feel connected. And they did this, they found out first they found monkeys had mirror neurons. Basically when a monkey was picking up a piece of food, and the same activation happened in the brain of a monkey who was the observer. And they realized that the brains mirror each other when they're in sync. They do this even further, where they find people who are in concerts together at live music performances, that brain waves actually synchronize between musicians and performers. And so I want to share a meditation with you that activates this circuitry in the brain that was designed by Ram Dass and Mirabai Bush, And what they did is they created this protocol for actually creating harmony in work atmospheres. And I'm going to just give it to you, and it's a very simple script. You could even just Google it. It's called Just Like Me. But what I'm going to ask you to do is pick a partner in this room, and it's really important that you're looking at each other eye to eye. And get comfortable. So really make sure your body's totally turned toward them. So yeah, I'm going to make you do it. They said it was a workshop, so I need your participation. She needs a partner here. Can you be her partner, please? Yeah. All right. So you guys, everybody has a partner? Okay, great. All right. And don't be afraid to look in each other's eyes. It's actually about connecting that way. Nothing's going to happen. Don't worry. All right. This person, you two have to look at each other. There you go. All right. This person has a body. I'll say it and just look at each other. You don't have to say it. So, this person has a body and mind just like me. Look in each other's eyes. This person has feelings, thoughts, and emotions just like me. This person has, during his or her life, experienced physical and emotional pain and suffering, just like me. This person, at some point, has been sad, just like me. This person has been disappointed, just like me. This person has sometimes been angry, just like me. This person has been hurt by others, just like me. This person has felt unworthy at times, just like me. This person worries, just like me. This person is frightened, sometimes, just like me. This person has longed for friendship, just like me. This person is learning about life, just like me. This person wants to be caring and kind to others, just like me. This person wants to be content with what life has given them, just like me. This person wishes to be free from pain and suffering, just like me. This person wishes to be happy, just like me. This person wishes to be safe, strong, and healthy, just like me. This person wishes to be loved, just like me. Now allow some wishes for well-being to arise. I wish that you have the strength and resources and social support to navigate the difficulties in your life with ease. I wish you to have the strength and resources and social support to live life with ease. I wish you to be free from pain and suffering. I wish that you'll be happy and peaceful. I wish that you will be loved because you are a fellow human being just like me. Now begin to thank your partner for participating with you and give thanks. So does anybody want to say what that was like for them? You felt connected. Yeah. I can't get you guys to stop talking to each other. So that's great. No, I'm super happy so this is how you raise. So we know scientifically when we create these social connections with each other and awareness that there's another human being, that empathy, biases drop, and we have those connections. So it's a very simple script. You guys could modulate it for like kid appropriateness. You could have 5 lines. It doesn't need to be so long. But it's an exercise I wanted you to be able to take to your classrooms where you can kind of create and build a little more harmony. And so because we're at 3:30, right? That's kind of what we said. Yeah. So I love this quote by Anne Lemmet. Hope begins in the dark, stubborn hope. That if you just watch and show up and try to do the right thing, the dawn will come. You wait and watch and work, and you don't give up. And that's what teachers do. I mean, you're hope for every student in your classroom. You're the one that sees and allows them to have a vision to dream. So keep your hope alive to keep their hope alive. So, and reach out. We ended early because it's Aloha Friday. And if anyone has any questions, we could chat. We can have an open discussion. We can say aloha, and I'm totally fine. So thanks for being here today, and thank you for all the incredible work you do. So.